There is that moment you almost dismiss when a thought crosses you quietly and the world answers before you finish explaining it away as imagination. You think of someone you have not spoken to in years, and before the thought cools, their name lights your screen as if reality overheard you. These moments do not arrive loudly, they arrive sideways, not demanding belief, only attention, carrying a peculiar emotional charge that feels different from surprise, closer to recognition, like remembering something without knowing what. Psychology once tried to frame this as coincidence, wrapped in meaning, a projection of the mind-seeking patterns where none objectively exist. Yet that explanation never fully settles the body because the body responds first, before analysis arrives, before skepticism gets dressed. You may notice how these moments feel personal without being dramatic, intimate without being controllable, as if something larger brushed past without stopping to explain itself. Carl Jung named this experience synchronicity, pointing toward meaningful alignment without direct cause, a linking of inner state and outer event through shared significance. What matters is not the label, but the feeling that something is communicating through pattern rather than language, through timing rather than instruction. The question quietly forms here, not as belief, but as curiosity. Are these events psychological tricks, or signals from a larger system you are already inside? Because once meaning appears uninvited, it becomes difficult to unsee, and the ordinary world begins to feel slightly transparent. You may sense even now that randomness no longer fully explains what is happening around you. And from that subtle shift, the conversation with reality has already begun. Once meaning enters your field of awareness, something subtle changes in how reality feels, as if the boundary between inside and outside has softened without asking permission. Not collapsed, just thinner. What follows is not belief, but sensitivity, a growing curiosity about why certain moments seem to echo inner states with uncomfortable precision. Ancient traditions spoke of this long before modern language attempted to catch up, describing a universe that responds not to effort, but to coherence, where inner alignment quietly reorganizes outer experience. Modern physics, with great humility, now gestures toward similar mysteries, suggesting that at fundamental levels, observation and system are not as separate as once assumed. This does not mean thoughts magically cause events in a simple line of force. It points instead toward entanglement, a condition where states mirror each other across distance, without direct exchange, bound by a deeper structure beneath visibility. You may notice how certain synchronicities arrive when emotion is heightened, when identity feels unstable, when choice is near, or when something old is dissolving. These moments often defy statistical comfort, not because they are impossible, but because they feel uncannily timed, responding to questions you did not speak aloud. A song lyric appears exactly when you were circling a decision. A book opens to a page answering an unformed worry. A stranger speaks a sentence you needed without knowing why. None of this proves a mechanism in the traditional sense, but it suggests a relationship, a feedback loop between consciousness and environment, where meaning travels through alignment rather than causality. Here, the idea of a quantum GPS begins to whisper itself into awareness, not as technology, but as metaphor, a navigational sensitivity embedded within lived experience, not directing you with commands, not predicting outcomes, simply reflecting position, orientation, and coherence, offering subtle markers that indicate when you are aligned with a deeper current of yourself. When you drift from that current, synchronicities thin out not as punishment but as loss of signal, like static increasing when tuning slips. When coherence returns, patterns reappear effortlessly, without drama, without announcement. This does not elevate the mind above matter, nor reduce reality to imagination. It places both inside a shared system, responsive, dynamic, alive with correspondence. You are not steering the universe, you are sensing it, and the sensing itself becomes the interface. There is often a quiet relief here as control loosens and participation replaces manipulation, allowing life to feel guided without being forced. You may sense just briefly that you are not separate from the path unfolding, but an expression moving within it. That recognition does not demand agreement. It only asks you to notice what has already been happening. After sensing that reality responds through correspondence, rather than force, a new tension naturally surfaces around direction. Not where you should go, but how you seem to know when something is off, even before consequences arrive. This is where the idea of a quantum GPS quietly takes shape, not as a mystical promise, but as a functional metaphor for how guidance appears without instructions. A GPS does not push the car, it reflects position. It does not judge the route, it updates orientation. Synchronicity functions similarly, offering information rather than outcomes, revealing alignment through pattern density, emotional resonance, and timing rather than success or failure. You may notice how certain paths feel strangely supported, not because everything is easy, but because relevant information keeps arriving exactly when needed. Introductions happen at the right moment. Resources surface without strain. Obstacles appear early before deeper investment. This is not luck. It is feedback. When you are aligned with a deeper coherence, the field seems to compress distance between question and response, reducing friction without removing challenge. When you drift into roles that are borrowed, expectations that are inherited, or timelines that do not belong to your nervous system, the signal becomes noisier. Delays increase. Confusion multiplies. Synchronicities scatter, not as punishment, as information. This reframing matters because it removes the emotional charge of being chosen or abandoned by something external, returning agency to interpretation rather than control. A quantum GPS does not promise arrival. It indicates direction relative to coherence. You may notice that synchronicities often intensify near thresholds, moments of decision endings or identity shifts, where internal alignment is fluid rather than fixed. In these moments, the system becomes more responsive, not because you are special, but because variables are actively reorganizing. When identity loosens, feedback sharpens. This is why synchronicities frequently accompany uncertainty, grief, creative emergence, or personal reinvention, times when the default state is no longer running the show. The breadcrumbs appear precisely when maps fail. Yet the mistake many make here is assuming synchronicities are rewards for positive thinking, signs of being on the right path in a moral or spiritual sense. That assumption collapses the system into superstition. Synchronicity is not approval, it is calibration. Sometimes the signal intensifies to warn, not to encourage, showing you what will happen if momentum continues unchecked. A repeated obstacle is also guidance. A closed door that appears again and again carries as much information as an effortless opening. The GPS does not care about preference. It reflects alignment. What becomes possible here is a shift from interpreting life through outcome fixation to reading it through pattern intelligence. You begin noticing not what happens, but how it happens, how often, and with what emotional texture. Does engagement feel expansive or constrictive? Does timing feel supportive or strained? Does repetition clarify or exhaust? These questions arise naturally without forcing analysis, because the body already knows the answers before language arrives. At this stage, you may find yourself trusting smaller signals, subtle adjustments, intuitive pauses, unexplained pulls, without needing them to justify themselves immediately. This is not surrendering discernment, it is refining it. A quantum GPS does not replace decision-making, it deepens it. You remain responsible for choice while being informed by a system that communicates through alignment rather than instruction. This is where navigation becomes relational rather than mechanical. You are not following signs. You are conversing with coherence. And once that conversation begins, it does not require belief to function, only attention, only willingness to notice what is already responding. The path does not announce itself. It reveals itself through feedback, and you are already reading it, whether consciously or not. The difference now is recognition, and recognition changes how every signal is received. If guidance is revealed through feedback rather than instruction, attention naturally begins to shift away from single events and toward what quietly repeats beneath them. Noticing deepens here, because a lone coincidence can be dismissed, but patterns accumulate weight carrying meaning not through drama, but through persistence. You may observe that synchronicities rarely speak in full sentences. They speak in fragments, in echoes, in motifs that return wearing different costumes. A phrase overheard in passing appears again in a book days later. A symbol repeats across unrelated contexts. A specific theme keeps circling your life, asking to be acknowledged rather than solved. This is where many misread the language. They focus on the event itself, asking what it means, instead of sensing what it points toward, the underlying coherence trying to surface through variation. Synchronicity does not operate as fortune-telling. It operates as pattern recognition across timelines. The field does not rearrange reality to impress you. It mirrors what is becoming coherent inside you, translating inner shifts into external correspondence, using whatever symbols are available. Meaning here is not fixed. It is relational. A symbol that feels electric to you may feel neutral to someone else, not because you are special, but because resonance is personal, tuned to your nervous system and lived history. This is why no universal dictionary for synchronicity exists. The language is intimate. You may notice that emotional charge is the key indicator, not excitement, but a quieter sense of rightness or friction that registers before interpretation begins. The body recognizes alignment faster than the mind. A repeated pattern that feels heavy, draining, or constrictive is not a test to overcome. It is information. Likewise, a recurring invitation that feels gently expansive is not a promise of ease, but a signal of coherence, indicating where energy moves more naturally. At this stage, discernment becomes less about asking, "What should I do?" and more about sensing what is being reflected back to me. Themes become more important than outcomes. Is the pattern pointing toward honesty, toward rest, toward completion, toward letting go of a version of you that no longer fits? Synchronicities often cluster around unresolved loops, surfacing where attention has been withheld or where identity is resisting transition. They do not force change, they illuminate it. You may also notice how the same lesson appears across different domains, relationships, work, health, creativity, until it is seen as pattern rather than misfortune. Once recognized, the pattern often dissolves on its own, not because you fixed it, but because awareness altered the system. There is a subtle humility required here. Synchronicity does not exist to validate narratives. It exists to restore coherence. Sometimes that coherence requires discomfort endings or the collapse of carefully constructed identities. The signal remains neutral. It is interpretation that adds emotion. As pattern literacy develops, urgency softens. You stop chasing meaning and start allowing it to reveal itself through accumulation, through gentle repetition, rather than sudden revelation. This is where patience quietly enters. Not passive waiting, but a willingness to let themes mature before naming them, trusting that clarity often arrives after recognition, not before. There may be moments when nothing seems to line up, when patterns disappear entirely. This absence is also communication signaling integration, a pause in feedback while a shift settles into the body. Silence here is not abandonment. It is stabilization. You may sense that you are no longer collecting signs, but being shaped by them, allowing pattern intelligence to reorganize perception rather than dictate action. This is a subtle but profound turn. Synchronicity stops being something that happens to you. It becomes something you are inside of, a conversation that does not rush, a language that speaks softly. And once you begin listening for themes rather than events, the noise thins naturally, revealing a quieter signal beneath the surface of daily life, one that has been speaking all along. As patterns become easier to sense, another shift unfolds quietly, almost unnoticed at first, involving not what appears but how clearly it is received. Because guidance does not increase through force, it clarifies through coherence. You may notice that synchronicities feel louder during moments of inner stillness, when the nervous system is regulated enough to register nuance instead of scanning for threat. Not calmer as a goal, more settled as a condition. Attention here behaves less like a spotlight and more like a tuning dial, adjusting sensitivity rather than directing focus. When the system is overloaded, rushed or braced signals still arrive, but they struggle to register beneath the noise of urgency. When attention softens, correspondence becomes visible without effort. This is not about positivity or mindset. It is about bandwidth. A regulated system can detect subtle feedback. A dysregulated one filters everything through survival logic, compressing meaning into binaries of danger or safety. Synchronicities often fade during periods of chronic stress, not because guidance withdraws, but because perception narrows. The signal remains. The receiver is busy. You may observe how moments of quiet presence, walking without distraction, resting without guilt, breathing without agenda, suddenly coincide with unexpected clarity, insights arriving sideways rather than through analysis. This is not accidental. Coherence increases resolution. When attention is no longer fractured, patterns reveal themselves without announcing significance. A passing comment lands differently. A choice feels obvious without justification. A recurring theme finally connects. This is why trying to manifest synchronicities often backfires. Effort introduces noise. Expectation collapses perception into outcome fixation, reducing sensitivity to subtler forms of feedback that do not match anticipation. The quantum GPS does not respond to demand. It responds to alignment. You may notice that synchronicities arrive most reliably when you are not looking for them, when identity loosens and curiosity replaces control. In these moments, attention becomes receptive rather than acquisitive, allowing the field to mirror coherence without resistance. There is a gentle discipline here, though it does not feel like effort. It is the discipline of noticing your state before interpreting events. Am I contracted or open? Rushed or present? Seeking confirmation or sensing correspondence? These questions are not judgments. They are calibration checks. As awareness deepens, synchronicity becomes less dramatic and more continuous, woven into ordinary life rather than punctuating it with spectacle. You stop waiting for signs and begin noticing feedback embedded in timing, tone, sequence, and emotional texture. This does not make life easier, it makes it clearer. Clarity, however, can feel destabilizing because it removes excuses, revealing where misalignment has been quietly tolerated. Here, a brief pause may emerge, a moment of internal quiet, where interpretation softens, allowing sensation to lead meaning rather than chasing explanation. Not silence as instruction, silence as space. From this space, choices feel less forced, less performative, because guidance is no longer externalized as approval or rejection. You begin trusting the felt sense of coherence, allowing alignment to inform action without needing certainty. This is not surrendering responsibility, it is refining agency. Attention becomes the interface, state becomes the signal, and synchronicity, once elusive, starts to feel less like interruption and more like accompaniment walking beside you rather than waving from afar. You are not tuning the universe, you are tuning yourself. And as coherence stabilizes, the language of alignment becomes easier to hear, not because it speaks louder, but because you are finally listening from the right frequency. The path does not require focus, it requires presence, and presence changes everything. As presence sharpens perception, another distinction quietly becomes unavoidable, one that separates engagement from interference without announcing itself as a rule. Because noticing a signal is not the same as trying to use it. Here, many slip without realizing it, mistaking responsiveness for strategy, turning correspondence into a tool rather than a conversation. Synchronicity does not ask to be leveraged. It asks to be met. The moment guidance becomes a means to an end, coherence tightens and the signal distorts. Not in punishment, but in fidelity, reflecting the state that approached it. You may notice how the impulse to control subtly returns dressed as intuition as you attempt to follow signs toward preferred outcomes rather than deeper alignment. This is not failure, it is a familiar pattern resurfacing the nervous system, reaching for certainty when ambiguity feels exposed. True engagement with synchronicity is quieter. It does not rush to interpret. It does not demand clarity. It does not force movement. It responds by adjusting posture, by softening resistance, by allowing the next step to emerge rather than be decided in advance. Participation here means letting correspondence influence orientation, not dictate action. A door opening does not require immediate entry. A repeated theme does not require instant resolution. Sometimes the most coherent response is waiting, allowing alignment to stabilize before translating insight into movement. This can feel counterintuitive, especially in cultures that reward decisiveness over attunement. Yet synchronicity does not operate on urgency, it operates on timing. You may observe that when you stop trying to extract meaning, meaning deepens. When you stop chasing direction, direction clarifies. This is the paradox. Engagement without control strengthens signal clarity because the system is no longer resisting itself. Synchronicity responds best to curiosity, not expectation, to presence, not pressure, to willingness, not demand. Here, identity subtly shifts again from actor manipulating circumstance to participant within a responsive system, neither passive nor dominant. You are not being guided like a child. You are being met like a collaborator. This requires trust, but not blind trust. A grounded trust rooted in bodily sensing rather than belief, noticing how certain responses increase coherence while others fragment it. When engagement feels tense, hurried, or performative, signal quality decreases. When engagement feels relaxed, spacious, and honest, correspondence strengthens naturally. This feedback loop teaches without instruction. There may be moments when synchronicities appear to withdraw, patterns thinning as if something has gone quiet. This is often misinterpreted as loss of alignment. More often it indicates integration, a phase where insight needs embodiment rather than additional information. Guidance pauses so identity can catch up. In these moments, resisting the urge to chase new signs becomes an act of coherence itself, honoring the rhythm of the system rather than overriding it. You may sense here that synchronicity is not something to follow, but something to walk with side by side, adjusting pace as conditions shift. Engagement becomes relational, responsive, fluid. You listen, you notice, you adjust. Nothing more is required, nothing less will suffice. This is where guidance becomes sustainable, not overwhelming, not addictive, but integrated into daily life without spectacle. The extraordinary dissolves into the ordinary, and the ordinary reveals itself as quietly intelligent. You are no longer asking, "What should I do?" You are sensing what is coherent now. That question does not demand an answer. It invites alignment. And alignment, once embodied, continues to guide without needing to announce itself as guidance. You are not trying to make something happen. You are allowing what is already moving to move through you. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything that follows. At some point, without a clear marker, you may realize that what has been changing is not the world responding to you, but who you understand yourself to be within it. This recognition arrives quietly, almost as an afterthought, when familiar reactions no longer fit the same way they once did, because following patterns over time does something subtle to identity. It loosens the grip of the isolated self. You may notice that decisions feel less like declarations of will and more like responses to context informed by a sense of timing rather than personal urgency. This is not a loss of self, it is a relocation of self. Identity shifts from being the one who pushes outcomes to the one who senses coherence, from central controller to responsive participant within a larger system. At first, this can feel destabilizing. The old markers of certainty begin to blur, and with them, the familiar story of who you thought you were starts to soften around the edges. Yet something steadier replaces it. A quieter confidence not based on prediction or control, but on relationship with the unfolding moment. You may notice that you argue less with what is happening, not because everything feels agreeable, but because resistance no longer feels like protection. Synchronicity, when engaged over time, applies gentle identity pressure, inviting you to notice where effort is compensating for misalignment. Roles that once felt necessary begin to feel heavy. Patterns of proving feel unnecessary. Urgency loses its authority. This is not detachment, it is recalibration. The system responds differently when identity loosens because correspondence no longer needs to break through defensive structures to be received. Feedback becomes cleaner. You may notice that guidance feels less dramatic now, less punctuated by surprise because it is being integrated continuously rather than arriving as interruption. Here the question shifts again. Not what does this mean, but who am I being when I meet this? Identity becomes fluid, situational, responsive, shaped by coherence rather than fixed traits. This can feel unfamiliar in cultures that reward consistency over authenticity, yet the nervous system recognizes the difference immediately. Alignment feels less exhausting. Presence feels less performative. You may sense that you are no longer trying to live the right life, but your life responding to what actually arises rather than what should. This is where synchronicity stops being something you track and starts being something that tracks with you, moving alongside as identity reorganizes around truth rather than expectation. There is often a quiet grief here, a letting go of versions of yourself that were built to survive rather than to align. That grief is not a setback. It is integration. You are not becoming someone new. You are shedding what was never coherent to begin with. In this phase, fewer signs are needed. The system trusts you more, not as reward, but because sensitivity has increased, reducing the need for repetition. When signals do appear, they feel almost redundant, confirming what was already sensed internally. This is not superiority. It is intimacy with alignment. You may notice that synchronicity no longer feels external. It feels conversational, a continuous feedback between inner state and outer movement, blurring the distinction until guidance feels less like direction and more like resonance. Identity here is no longer defined by narrative. It is defined by coherence. And coherence, once embodied, exerts its own quiet gravity, reorganizing choices, relationships, and trajectories without force. You are not trying to become aligned. You are noticing where you already are. That noticing is enough. because identity, once released from control, naturally settles into the shape of what fits, and what fits does not need to announce itself. It simply feels right, and you recognize it immediately. There comes a phase where alignment is no longer questioned, yet movement still feels suspended, as if something is gathering rather than progressing. This is often where thresholds appear. Not dramatic turning points, but quiet edges between versions of life moments, when the old no longer fits and the new has not yet taken form. Synchronicities tend to concentrate here. You may notice an increase in correspondence precisely when clarity feels least accessible, when decisions feel weighty, and when identity is temporarily unanchored. This is not coincidence. Thresholds loosen structure, and when structure loosens, feedback becomes more visible. The system is reorganizing. Variables are in flux. Synchronicities emerge as markers not to push you forward, but to orient you within uncertainty, offering reassurance that movement is occurring even when direction feels unclear. You may sense patterns repeating with heightened intensity, symbols clustering more tightly, conversations circling the same themes, as if the field is highlighting what matters before the crossing completes. These moments often carry emotional density, excitement mixed with grief, relief braided with fear, curiosity standing beside hesitation. Synchronicity does not resolve this tension, it holds it. It signals that you are at an edge worth honoring rather than rushing through. Here, many feel tempted to force closure, to interpret signs as permission to leap prematurely, bypassing the integration required at the threshold. But thresholds are not shortcuts. They are recalibration zones. Synchronicities appearing here are not instructions to act, but confirmations that attention is correctly placed, that you are listening at the right depth. The GPS analogy evolves again. At thresholds, the system is not rerouting, it is recalculating. Pauses lengthen. Feedback refines. Noise decreases. You may notice that external validation fades during these phases, replaced by internal sensing that cannot be easily explained or defended. This is intentional. Thresholds are crossed through recognition, not consensus. Often synchronicities at this stage point backward rather than forward, resurfacing memories, unfinished conversations, or long-forgotten interests, inviting integration before movement resumes. Nothing is wasted. Every fragment matters. The field does not drag you across thresholds. It waits until coherence stabilizes. You may feel suspended between timelines, neither fully here nor there, while patterns gently remind you that the crossing is underway. This suspension can feel uncomfortable, but discomfort here is not misalignment. It is transition. Synchronicity acts as a stabilizing reference, a reminder that you are not lost merely between configurations. There may be moments of sudden clarity followed by renewed ambiguity. This oscillation is normal. Thresholds rarely resolve cleanly, they unfold. What matters is not speed, but fidelity to the process, allowing identity to reorganize at its own pace. In this phase, fewer dramatic signs are needed. The ones that appear are precise, almost surgical, cutting through doubt without eliminating it entirely. They do not remove choice, they contextualize it. You may sense that something irreversible is happening, even if no external evidence confirms it yet. That sensing is not imagination. It is alignment adjusting to a new configuration. Synchronicities here serve as witnesses rather than guides, acknowledging the crossing without directing how it should look. They mark passage, not destination, and once the threshold is crossed, often without ceremony, patterns thin again, feedback settling into quieter rhythms. Only later do you realize how profoundly things have shifted. At the time, it simply felt like standing still while becoming someone else. Synchronicity did not carry you across. It stood beside you while you did. That companionship is its deepest function, to be present at the edges, to signal coherence during uncertainty, to remind you that becoming is already happening even when you cannot yet name what you are becoming. And that recognition is enough to keep moving even when movement feels invisible. After a threshold has been crossed, something subtle lingers, a quiet knowing that does not announce itself as insight, but settles like gravity. You may not think about synchronicity as often now, yet it feels closer. Less like a phenomenon, more like a presence woven into ordinary perception. This is often where the deeper realization emerges, not as belief, but as recognition that what has been guiding you was never external to begin with. The intelligence responding through pattern does not sit outside your life watching from a distance. It moves through the same field you move through attention, through timing, through sensation. Here the old question, is this real, begins to dissolve, not because proof has been provided, but because the question itself no longer fits the experience. You may notice that synchronicities feel less surprising now, not because they have stopped, but because they feel familiar, almost obvious in retrospect. Of course, this conversation appeared now. Of course, this connection resurfaced here. Of course, this idea arrived when it did, not because it was planned, because it was coherent. This is where the sense of a larger intelligence becomes intimate rather than abstract. Not a cosmic mind issuing signals, but a systemic awareness expressing itself through relational movement through you and around you simultaneously. The observer and the field feel less distinct here, not merged in a dramatic way, simply less divided. You may sense that guidance does not come from somewhere else, but from the same place your deepest knowing arises, translated into form so it can be noticed without effort. Synchronicity becomes a mirror that reflects not destiny, but alignment, showing you when your inner state and outer movement are speaking the same language. This realization can be unsettling. If guidance is not external, then responsibility returns inward, not as pressure, but as presence. You are no longer waiting for permission. You are sensing coherence. The intelligence you thought was guiding you begins to feel like something you are participating in, a distributed awareness, expressing itself through many nodes, many lives, many moments of recognition. Here, humility deepens. You are not special for noticing. You are receptive, and receptivity is not a trait. It is a state. You may notice that synchronicities now often arrive as confirmations, rather than surprises, acknowledging alignment rather than correcting course. They feel like nods, quiet acknowledgments that movement is integrated, that identity and action are not at odds. There may still be confusion, there may still be doubt, but beneath it, a steadiness holds. A sense that even uncertainty is part of the system, not an error to be eliminated. This is where the language of synchronicity becomes almost unnecessary. You no longer need to name it to feel its function. You sense when something fits. You sense when something doesn't. You adjust accordingly. The GPS analogy fades here, not because guidance disappears, but because navigation has been internalized, embodied as attunement, rather than interpreted as signal. You are not being led, you are moving with. This is not enlightenment, it is integration. The intelligence you once sought outside reveals itself as relational, alive in timing, choice, and presence. Synchronicity was never trying to impress you. It was introducing you to this recognition slowly, gently through pattern rather than proclamation. Now the question is no longer whether the universe is communicating with you. It is whether you are willing to recognize yourself as part of what is communicating. That recognition does not require words. It settles into the body. It changes how you listen. It changes how you move. And from this place, the final threshold quietly comes into view, not as a destination, but as a remembering of something that was never absent, something you have already been touching all along. The conversation has not ended. It has simply become mutual. What emerges now is not a new concept, but a deepening recognition of what has been quietly stabilizing beneath every previous insight. The patterns, the thresholds, the guidance that never shouted. They were not leading you somewhere else. They were leading you back. The I am code is not something to activate through effort or belief, because it was never dormant in the way the mind imagines dormancy. It is not a switch. It is a recognition of self as coherent presence within the field, neither separate from guidance nor dependent on it. Synchronicity, when seen from here, reveals its final function, not as navigation toward identity, but as confirmation of identity already embodied. The breadcrumbs did not exist to show you who to become. They existed to remind you of who you were being whenever coherence was present. Every meaningful alignment reflected a moment when action, attention, and identity briefly agreed. Those moments felt right because they were true. The I am code lives in that truth, not as affirmation, but as state. You may notice now that the language shifts subtly. Less, this is happening to me. More, this is moving through me. This is not grandiosity. It is responsibility without burden. Self-sovereignty here does not mean control over outcomes. It means authorship of state. You are no longer waiting for permission from signs, symbols, or timing. You are sensing when your presence is coherent and allowing action to arise from that coherence. Synchronicities still appear, but they feel secondary, like reflections rather than instructions. They no longer determine direction. They confirm alignment. This is the final threshold, not a peak experience, a stabilization, the realization that guidance was never external authority, but a relational mirror showing you when you were inhabiting yourself fully. I am is not a declaration to the universe. It is a recognition of being. When this recognition settles, urgency dissolves. The need to decode every event softens. Life does not become simpler, it becomes truer. You may notice that choices feel cleaner now, not because outcomes are guaranteed, but because action no longer requires justification beyond coherence. You trust yourself not as personality, but as presence. This is where embodiment completes the circuit. The nervous system relaxes. Attention widens. Identity stabilizes without hardening. You are not finished. There is no completion here, but there is arrival in the only sense that matters, a return to authorship, to participation, to being rather than seeking. Synchronicity does not end. It becomes background music, sometimes audible, sometimes silent, always responsive. You no longer ask whether you are being guided. You sense when you are aligned, and alignment guides naturally without needing a name. This is the I am code, not something you unlock, something you remember. And in that remembering, the conversation with reality continues not as question and answer, but as movement and response woven together without separation. You were never off the path. You were learning how to feel it from the inside, and now you do. Nothing more needs to be added now. That may be the most unfamiliar part, because the mind expects a conclusion, a summary, a final instruction that turns understanding into something actionable. But what has been unfolding here does not resolve through action. It settles through embodiment. You may notice that the impulse to analyze is quieter, replaced by a softer sense of orientation, as if something has gently clicked into place without fanfare. Not certainty at all, but familiarity, the feeling of having returned to a room you did not realize you had left. Synchronicity seen from here no longer needs defending or explaining. It becomes one of many ways coherence reveals itself, alongside breath timing, honesty, and the subtle relief of not forcing what no longer fits. You may notice that life continues as before on the surface. The same responsibilities, the same uncertainties, the same unpredictability. yet something underneath has reorganized. You are not scanning for signs as much. You are sensing alignment, and that sensing does not require vigilance. It operates quietly, like balance adjusting continuously without drawing attention to itself. If synchronicities appear, they are met with appreciation rather than urgency. If they do not, there is no sense of loss. Presence has replaced dependency. This is not transcendence, it is grounding, a deeper inhabiting of your own life, where guidance feels less like something arriving and more like something you are already carrying. You may notice moments when the old habit returns the urge to seek confirmation, to ask whether you are doing this right. When that happens, nothing has gone wrong. It is simply another pattern surfacing, to be met with the same awareness that brought you here. Coherence is not fragile. It does not shatter when questioned. It responds by deepening. The I am recognition does not demand maintenance. It stabilizes through living, through choices made from presence rather than fear, through pauses that are allowed rather than justified, through listening that does not rush to respond. There may be times when everything feels quiet again, when no patterns stand out, when life feels ordinary to the point of boredom. That too is alignment. Silence does not mean absence. It means integration. You do not need to hold on to this understanding. It will return whenever coherence is present, whenever attention softens enough to feel rather than interpret. The conversation with reality continues whether you notice it or not. The difference now is that you recognize yourself as part of it, not separate, not special, included, and that inclusion changes how you move, how you choose, how you rest. Nothing needs to be concluded, nothing needs to be claimed. You are already inside what you were looking for. The path is not ahead of you, it is under your feet. And as you continue living, noticing, adjusting, the language of alignment will speak when needed and remain quiet when not. Both are guidance, both are enough. The transmission does not end, it settles. And from that settling, life continues not as something to decode, but as something to inhabit, fully, gently, presently. That is all.